Historians as Interpreters of Progress and Nation, Part 2, English Historiography in the Age of Revolution. During the second half of the 18th century, English historiography carried the marks of David Hume, Robertson, and Gibbon. A craft in the best sense of the word, it also was an instrument of public life, never far from the great political concerns and always cognizant of its role of educating those who participated in public life. Hence, when France experienced her revolutionary turmoil, the experience had an immediate effect on English historical thought, although written assessments in a thoughtful and systematic manner came relatively late. The gradualist thesis under stress. The American Revolution cost the English dearly in possessions and imperial pride, but it nevertheless had less influence on English historiography than the French Revolution, because it did not involve social reconstruction. Even after 1783, Americans respected the English tradition, and in many respects, ways continued in it. The French, however, attempted to reconstruct their society according to abstract ideals, went through the Reign of Terror, and finally supported the imperial aspirations of Napoleon. The French Revolution contradicted the English ideal of a gradual social development on the basis of the Great Social and Political Compromise of 1688, which had just had its centenary celebrations, and the third threatened English security, influence, and power. Amid the many voices of concern, hatred, and fear raised when the events of the early Revolution became known, Sir Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France sounded already in 1790 the basic theme of English post-revolutionary historiography. A good society was shaped by tradition according to the wisdom of the ages. Attempts to use weak human reason and will in place of this wisdom could only result in anarchy, which could not be remedied once tradition was destroyed. History, of course, emerged in Burke's view as the supreme instructor of a people. Soon the Burkean prophecy seemed more borne out by the Reign of Terror and by the end of the radical revolutionary dream in Napoleon's rule, and the English view a turn of despotism. The ensuing years of war returned old-style politics and diplomacy to the center of interest, and with them also the familiar diplomatic and military history. By the time of the restoration of the Bourbons in 1815, distance and time had facilitated a reassessment of the French revolutionary events. Documents and memoirs hostile to the revolution, once credulously accepted, were now sifted more critically by writers such as J. Adolphus. In general, the Burkean theme was revised rather than rejected, when it was conceded that in its early stages the French Revolution had made no complete break with the past. From 1789 to 1792, only remedies for inequities had been brought about, and only the Jacobins cut the thread of the proper gradual French development. That was the message in the essays and lectures by William Smith of Cambridge, the first academician to deal with the revolution. But in subtle ways, the revolution and the issues that it raised had already penetrated academia in the field of ancient history. The social issues and ancient history, political controversy intruded into classical studies because around 1800, the English, although they still looked upon these studies as fields of scholarship, also regarded them as a splendid tool for educating gentlemen in public affairs. Thus, the History of Greece by John Gillies expressed the proper sentiments against the weaknesses of both republics and despots, and hailed the limited monarchy which the Gauls never knew and the English were proud to have. That was in 1786, when the old regime, Louis the XVI and Marie Antoinette, still seemed secure. William Mitford's History of Greece bore already marks of the revolutionary events in France. Mitford, a high Tory, rejected the usually favored democratic Athens as a model, treated Philip of Macedonia with sympathy, and attacked all demagogues. After 1815, with England once more secure, the tranquility of routine returned to classical studies, with the next shocks originating not with the minds of revolutionaries, but in those of innovative German scholars like Wolff, Bach, Müller, Niebuhr, and Kreuzer. In Oxford and Cambridge, especially in the circles around Professors Hare and Thirlwall, echoed the German call for a reconstruction of the total ancient life context instead of the isolated text only. Also, language came to be understood as the expression of the very spirit of a nation, a witness to the nation's inner forces. Thus, the vernacular language could no longer be considered inferior to the supposedly perfect classical Latin and Greek. In time, as will be seen, that view would also transform the Anglo-Saxon studies begun by Sharon Turner into the sophisticated studies of Anglo-Saxon language and life by John Mitchell Kimball. From classical philology, Thomas Arnold built a bridge to the Germanized historical studies of William Stubbs and Edward Augustin Freeman. With the gradual transformation of philology in the New German manner, the historizing of the English intellectual world had begun, a transformation with definite limits. For example, much of English classical philology, even Grote's History of Greece from 1846 to 1856, which was a stellar scholarly achievement, preserved the didactic link between classical studies and public affairs. In a period when the question of suffrage extension moved the English, Grote, a liberal Whig member of Parliament, wrote with sympathy on Athenian democracy and reconfirmed the long-standing negative assessment of anything Greek dating from Alexander the Great. The triumph of the gradualist thesis. In the year 1830, the July Revolution in France gave a jolt to the English conviction that gradual development had finally triumphed in France, and it happened at a time when the great reform discussions were intensifying in England. Even the Reform Bill of 1832 did not alleviate the doubts about the idea that revolutionary thrust could be deflected by timely reform. Soon after, Sir Archibald Alison argued in his influential History of Europe from the French Revolution to the Restoration of the Bourbons that even the slightest concession could set in motion an uncontrollable democratic revolution that would threaten all tradition. Both Alison and John Croker, who argued the same case in his essays, already documented their studies well and adhered to some of the new critical standards. But their doctrine of an inevitable development towards democracy, triggered by reforms, suffered neglect when relative tranquility returned to English public life. The Whigs, gradualists at heart, pointed out that even the revolutionary year of 1848 had passed without significant disturbances in England. The optimism of the period found its unrivaled spokesman in Thomas B. Macaulay. In his History of England from the Accession of James II, written from 1849 to 1861, Thomas Macaulay demonstrated that mid-19th century England was no accidental creation but the result of centuries of development. In the case of England, change had never contradicted continuity and, by implication, never would. Macaulay's history represented a peak in a peculiarly English historiographical development, shaped by a remarkable sense of separateness and pride. From the 1600s, elements of what Herbert Butterfield called the Whig interpretation of history had appeared, which in its broadest sense asserted that English history offered an especially fallacious reconciliation of past, present, and future, and that the English were wise enough to bring about the feat of venerating the past without binding too closely either the present or the future in the process. In its earliest form, that interpretation asserted an ancient constitution anchored in free Germanic institutions and confirmed by the Glorious Revolution of 1688. In the 19th century, Macaulay and others stressed the Magna Carta as the onset of the march to liberty in English history, and Macaulay shaped this and other elements, including Turner's Anglo-Saxonism, Burke's traditionalism, and Hallam's Constitution of Liberty, with a general conviction of progress into a rousing message for the people of Victorian England. Macaulay was well equipped for what the English wished historians to do: educate the public through history. Trained in law, he had served England in Parliament, in the Cabinet, and as a member of the Supreme Council of India. From the publication of his first essay, his style captivated the public, as did his good sense of the past and firm Whiggish convictions. When composing his history, one of the most famous and successful historical books ever written, he labored hard to ascertain the facts about the past, but worked just as hard to write elegantly and lucidly. After all, facts were the mere dross of history, and those who miserably neglect the art of narration should remember that histories of great empires written by men of great ability lie unread on the shelves of ostentatious libraries. Macaulay wished to produce something which shall for a few days supersede the last fashionable novel on the tables of young ladies, and succeeded in doing so. In an age when few books were being sold in large numbers, his history, sold in the hundreds of thousands, was translated into 11 languages and was actually read, not merely displayed on bookshelves. That Macaulay's fame diminished with the same speed at which it had gathered. One reason for this was that he wrote just before new critical standards of historical scholarship had reached England from the continent. Once these standards had begun to shape the writing of English history, historians called Macaulay's assessment of sources unsophisticated and his characterizations of persons and events facile. More important, his judgments were based on his conviction that English society at mid-19th century would supply all standards of measurement. When soon after 1862, even the English world proved to be more complex than liberals had suspected, Macaulay's history lost its power to convince. His world had been one without mysteries or unsolved problems. Had not English development been unfailingly towards fuller liberty, greater self-government, and higher civilization? With the plot known and with no fundamental change to come in the additional scenes, the good and evil and the heroes and villains in the English drama could all be easily ascertained. Macaulay, sure of his judgment, made such identifications and told the world about them. His history suited the majority of Englishmen by its virile directness, its honest clearness, its bold definiteness. Macaulay is never afraid, he never shirks, he never dissembles or cloaks, he never says perhaps or maybe, or the facts are obscure, nor authorities differ. To be sure, there is danger in that brilliant rhetoric. The glow of declamation disdains the sickly hue of circumspection. But men go to the window when a fire engine gallops through the street. A gentler summons might not fetch them. There is something of martial music about Macaulay's prose. There is that in it which excites a man. It belongs to a great advocate, not to blindfolded justice, holding her cautious scales and doling out its ifs, buts, howevers, as she balances probabilities with all the diffidence of doubt. History had yielded its meaning to Macaulay, and he pronounced it. The calculating, unheroic, sober, and peering around the corner middle class would safeguard England's welfare forever. The history of England traced that class's march to victory, and in the process painted a broad picture of the English past. Indeed, Macaulay had pointed an accusing finger at the history of mere statecraft, and war as he spoke out in favor of a history dealing with the whole life of the nation. His execution did not match his ideal, and the book's intended scope proved too large. Macaulay's early death left it a fragment reaching only from 1685 to 1702. Other views of the past at the time, including the theme of the gradual realization of liberty in England, fit the English conditions well. English society had not recently been divided by a ditch filled with blood. Chateaubriand's characterization of France, and had no need to pick up the pieces of a broken tradition. That fact relieved English historians of much of the need for the romantic concept of the nation as the unit transcending all social divisions, grievances, and resentments. But while the British lacked exact counterparts to Macaulay and the German nationalist historians, they too were fascinated by the question of national identity and the romantic answer to it. In the 1760s, James Macpherson published what he claimed to be translations of two epics and several poems by the 3rd century Gaelic poet Ossian. The ensuing controversy over the authenticity of Ossian and his works stimulated much interest in the early history of the British Isles. It came at a time when Rousseau and Herder were calling for an appreciation of early mankind. Sharon Turner, whose studies of the Norse language assisted scholars interested in early English history, complained as an Englishman that we roam the most distant oceans to explore the manners of uncultivated savages, and even the philosopher reads with interest every description of their customs and transactions. Why should he, an Englishman, then despise the first state and the improving progress of his Saxon ancestors? And so, Sharon Turner himself published a history of the Anglo-Saxons, in which the Germans, while not flawless, were vigorous and certainly worthy of being acknowledged as the English ancestors. In 1815, Beowulf was published, and during the 1810s and 1820s, the historical novels of Sir Walter Scott enthralled the public. The novels caught the spirit of the Middle Ages through the empathy of the author, and brilliantly written, aroused curiosity about that period. This fascination opened a whole historical period to the British imagination. The first rescue of the Middle Ages from obscurity was attempted in the year 1818 by Henry Hallam, with his view on the state of Europe during the Middle Ages. His willingness to study the Middle Ages was the more remarkable for the fact that he did not write out of any romantic enthusiasm. He did not even like the period. As he studied state after state between the time of King Clovis and 1494, he formed some harsh judgments on whole sections of the Middle Ages. Many considerable periods of time, he said, especially before the 12th century, may justly be deemed so barren of events worthy of remembrance that a single sentence or paragraph is often sufficient to give the character of entire generations and of long dynasties of obscure kings. Still, Hallam's work opened the door to further medieval studies. It helped that Hallam wrote not just about battles and kings, but mostly about institutions and even about language, literature, and the church, of course. His contention, formulated more precisely in his constitutional history, was that the English government had always been, or was meant to be, a constitutionally limited monarchy, the ancient constitution concept. This thrust medieval history into the midst of contemporary political debates and was a marvelous assurance against it being once more forgotten. The issue of the Fourth Estate. The people. Only 8 years after Macaulay's death, his assumption of permanence for mid-century English society proved an illusion. In the year 1867, the suffrage had to be widened again, a signal of things to come. Not only could calls for democracy no longer be satisfied by a limited election reform, the freedoms granted by a liberal order would also not let harsh working conditions for laborers go unchallenged for long. Some Tories, in fact, had already been working for laws to ameliorate these conditions in the framework of a laissez-faire economy. But as for changes in the direction of democracy, Whigs and Tories alike agreed that social reforms were meant to safeguard tradition and to prevent the unleashing of the destructive forces of democracy. Thomas Carlyle, a Scot of humble origin who struggled to follow the mandate of Sir Walter Scott and Macaulay, that one must reconstruct life in its fullness, saw things completely different. At times he became distraught over the paucity of sources available even to the most ardent Rankian or Niebuhrian seeker of sources, while from such a slim base no binding lessons or philosophy of history could be derived. Patient observers could perceive the fullness of life and deepen their awareness of the divine. But in that sense, history was an appeal to the innermost qualities of human beings, as well as a witness to a divine or religious plan. At a far distance from traditional English historiography, with its cautious empiricism and persistent gradualism, Carlyle asserted a metaphysical interpretation of the course of human life in time. History was a drama of that divine justice which is asserted in great upheavals and forgotten in centuries of quietude. In the turbulent times, life triumphs over all schemes of thought that in quiescence periods fossilize the products of bygone creativity. Thus, the English idea of gradual reform to prevent revolutionary eruptions was doomed to fail, just as the decadent French elite had failed to preserve an encrusted social order, albeit one more repressive. There were two forces of innovation that erupted into history from time to time: the people and the great men, or heroes. Carlyle did not romanticize the people, despite their historical role, but he insisted that history must show the inward life and the spiritual condition of the people. Above all, it must be filled by living men, with color in their cheeks, with passions in their stomachs, and the idioms, features, and vitalities of very men. Such an obligation to depict the fullness of human life will lead historians away from tales of kings, senate houses, or kings' antechambers. After all, which he said was the greatest innovator, which was the more important personages in man's history, he who first led armies over the Alps and gained the victories of Cannae and Thrasymene, or the nameless boor who first hammered out for himself an iron spade. When the oak tree is felled, the whole forest echoes with it, but 100 acorns are planted silently by some unnoticed breeze. Battles and war tumults, which for the time dim every ear, and with joy or terror intoxicate every heart, pass away like tavern brawls. In his The French Revolution, which after its publication in 1837 made him famous, Carlyle did not trace constitutions, rights, or laws, but listened to the heartbeat of life. The revolution was no struggle over constitutional arrangements, but an act of justice, divinely willed at the time, in favor of millions of poor people. One of those infrequent eruptions by which life created forms and social orders only have to them preserved well beyond the point where they agreed with public wishes and collective habits. Then the creative anarchy, ever present in people, would once more break forth in revolutions and destroy the moribund institutions until the rampant forces were tamed, just as the French Revolution ended in the Napoleonic Wars. Given the English solution with its preference for gradual change, would the English society ever become one of those vast solecisms, moribund and ready to collapse? Carlyle stated clearly that it already was just that. In the end, Carlyle did not entrust the cause of life, the spirit, or the divine idea to the people. He could not overlook that the people were unregenerate sinners in his religious views, and that over long stretches the people had not been creators or actors, but a gray, dull mass. The true hope sprang from the great men, the true kings by divine right. He said, "For as I take it, universal history, the history of what man has accomplished in this world, is at bottom the history of the great men who have worked here. They were the leaders of men, these great ones, the modelers, patterns, and, in a wide sense, creators of whatever the general mass of men contrived to do as to attain." In his books on Cromwell and Frederick the Great, Carlyle showed these great men to be the brilliant manifestations of life's spiritual core, the text of historical revelation. If, he said, history is the essence of innumerable biographies, then the biographies of the heroes, be they warriors, rulers, artists, or prophets, yielded more than that essence. Once more, the institutions were secondary, since the heroes more often destroyed than recognized them. Carlyle's record as a historian is mixed. He had widened the meaning of the term people beyond the narrow image of the Fourth Estate, waiting to enter or destroy the established societies. His ideas, rooted in metaphysics, did not fit in well with the logic of the English historical argument. The Fourth Estate, on the other hand, found its inspiration not in being the manifestation of Carlyle's spirit of life, but in the wish to vote and to bring about a more decent life for its members, a goal for which Carlyle himself had little sympathy. In this limited sense, he had been a precursor of a broad social history. Yet his great men theory, celebrated by some, would eventually be outdated as a contradiction of that very same social history. As a historical scholar, however, Carlyle found no favor with those who were influenced to a higher degree than Carlyle by the German critical school and thought of themselves as scientific historians. They accused Carlyle of not having heeded his own advice that the two pinions of history were stern accuracy in inquiry and bold imagination in interpretation. The critics, among them Stubbs, Freeman, and Green, saw only the romantic who talked of the spirit, painted vivid pictures, and spoke in ecstatic terms. His researches for the French Revolution had had too narrow a base, and thus no number of footnotes could earn him the label scientific. History as Ronchian science. William Stubbs and Edward Freeman paralleled the work of the English classical scholars when they transformed English historiography according to the highly successful and esteemed German model. They instituted history as an academic discipline, in the new sense, one that wished for a national education not through well-told stories, but about the past, or from fixed lessons gleaned from the past, but through a mastery of the development of the English nation by means of vigorous studies of the sources. But the two men did not merely transplant the procedures of Ronk's seminar to England. They worked out an English version of the German views on the divine, nature, Volk, and universal history. From it arose the peculiar Germanist interpretation of English history, best discussed later in the context of institutional history.